Welcome back, everybody. What we're going to look at now is a little bit of chemistry. And I realize this might not seem like the most exciting topic, but it's something that's going to be rather important for the rest of the course to make sense to you. So once we start talking about DNA and how that works and how proteins work and all that cool stuff, you will have to understand a little bit of basic chemistry. Now, a lot of this is going to be straight up review for some of you. I'm sure some of you have learned all this before, so that should be easy for you guys. If it's something that is new to you, just take a bit of time and make sure that it makes sense. What you're seeing here is what a cell membrane looks like under very high magnification. Now, you can't see something like this with a light microscope. And with an electron microscope, you're not going to see things bopping around. So this is an artist's rendition of what this might look like. Now, first of all, notice that things are in constant motion. And that's true of molecules. They're constantly moving around and bumping into each other and interacting. At the top and bottom, you've got water molecules. So notice that they're red and white. The white are hydrogen atoms, and the red is oxygen. So where you can see just one of these guys, you'll notice that it looks like kind of a Mickey Mouse head here. We've got these two little white ears, which are the hydrogens, and then the oxygen attached to that. So H2O, that is a water molecule. We've got yellow bits here, these big blobby bits, which are the heads of the phospholipids. We'll get to that later. We'll talk about this in much more detail when we talk about membranes. And then hanging off of that towards the interior of the membrane are these kinky green strands, which are fatty acids. Now note that there's also this big blue thing in the middle, and it consists of these spiral structures. That big blue thing is a protein. It's an aquaporin, and an aquaporin is a channel that allows water to get across the membrane more quickly. So water can cross the membrane on its own, but it does it about 10 times more effectively, 10 times more quickly through aquaporins. So again, take-home message here is that things are constantly in motion. Water is constantly in motion. The water molecules are bumping into each other, and so on. And before we start talking about these parts of the membrane, before we start talking about the large molecules that make up the membrane, we have to go a little bit closer in and take a look at the molecules themselves and take a look at the atoms themselves. Let's start at the beginning. We're going to start really simple. We're going to look at the structure of the atom. And if you know this stuff, if you remember it, you're comfortable with this stuff, feel free to roll your eyes and skip forward a bit, or watch the stuff. It can't hurt. But for those of you that need and want to review, that's what we're going to do right now. So what you're seeing here is a model of a helium atom. And the helium atom has two protons. Those are shown with the positive charges in pink. And then we've got two neutrons surrounding that, and together they make up the nucleus of the atom. And then around that we have electrons. We would have two electrons. So you're probably wondering, okay, if there's two electrons, why are we seeing this kind of splatter of little blue dots? This is actually a probability graph of where you might find those electrons. Electrons are moving around at incredible speed. They're very tiny. And they're also, relatively speaking, far away from the nucleus. Most of the atom is empty space. And this is a probability graph of where you might encounter those two electrons. It's most likely to occur within the darker blue portion. But you're probably, like I said, not used to seeing that particular depiction of the atom. You're used to seeing the atom represented as kind of a solar system, and we'll get to that in just a second. But anyway, we have the nucleus, which is very massive. The vast majority of the mass or material of the atom is found in the nucleus. And in the nucleus we have protons, and we may or may not have neutrons. Hydrogen doesn't usually have a neutron, although it can. It can even have two sometimes. But within the nucleus, we have protons for sure, and we may have neutrons, and the number of neutrons may vary for any particular atom. Around that we have electrons, and I've said that they're everywhere. They're not really, but we can't predict exactly where they are. And you might have heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Certainly not something we're going to talk about, but that's what that relates to. So electrons are very tiny. They're negatively charged. Protons are positively charged. The charges between the two balance out in most whole atoms, but they don't in ions, as we'll see. And then neutrons are neutral. Atoms and molecules are always in constant motion. The electrons are whipping around very, very quickly. We cannot predict where they're going to be at any one particular point in time. The protons and neutrons in the nucleus are vibrating. And molecules and atoms are constantly smashing into each other. So that's a key point here. Things are always moving around. The only time that these motions stop is at absolute zero, and that's when the vibrations and so on stop. But that's, of course, not something we're going to deal with in biology. All right, now this is more likely the model of the atom that you're used to. And it's not all that accurate necessarily, but it does show electrons orbiting around the nucleus, and it looks like a little miniature solar system. So note that we have an equal number of protons and electrons. So overall, the atom is neutrally charged, right? The negative charge and the positive charge cancel out, and then we have our neutrons that are neutral to begin with. And the electrons are going to orbit around in what are called shells, kind of like orbits. Now they're not nice, neat circles like this. And if you've taken some more advanced chemistry courses, you know that the orbits are actually dumbbell shaped and things get a lot more complicated. But for our purposes, this is fine. This is what's known as the Rutherford atom model. I'm not going to ask you about that, but this is the simplest model that we have of the atom that works in most cases, and it'll work for what we're doing in Bio 111 and Bio 112. Let's take a closer look at the atomic structure. The atom is the smallest subunit of matter that still retains the property of an element. So what is an element? An element is something that's made up of only one type of atom. So if you're lucky enough to have a big 100% pure gold bar in front of you, and it probably wouldn't be 100% pure, but let's pretend it is, it consists of nothing but gold. You could take that bar, you could cut it in half, you could cut that half in half, you could cut that in half, you could keep cutting it in half until you got down to one atom. And that atom would share all the properties and characteristics that we associate with gold. And of course, if we divided the atom further, then we lose those characteristics. Atoms are made up, as we mentioned, of subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are neutrons, protons, and electrons. Neutrons, no charge, protons, positive charge, electrons, negative charge. Now we can break up those parts too. We can get into quarks and things like that, but we're obviously not going to do that in this course. The differential charge between protons and electrons keeps the atoms together. So there's an attraction between negative and positive charges. And that means that the electrons will move around in an orbit around the nucleus that contains the protons. They're attracted to that. But normally they won't go flying off because of that attraction between unlike charges. So opposites attract. Chemical reactions occur when electrons are exchanged between atoms or between molecules. So electrons can be lost, they can be gained, or they can be shared between two atoms. I've defined a few things, but let's define a few more. So an element, as I mentioned, is made up of identical atoms. So it's a pure substance that has distinct properties. So gold, for instance, if you have a gold coin or a gold nugget in front of you, it's pretty good at conducting electricity. That's one of its characteristics. It's malleable, which means you can deform it. So the old timers, when they would get a gold nugget in their their gold pan. They'd bite into it, and if they were able to leave a little tooth mark in it, that meant it was gold because they were able to deform that nugget. Isotopes are atoms of an element that don't differ in their chemical properties, but differ in the number of neutrons. So the chemical properties are determined by the number of electrons and protons. Remember, chemistry is all about swapping and exchanging and exciting electrons. Neutrons don't really play a role in that. However, if you change the number of neutrons, that can make the atom unstable, and it becomes what's known as a radioisotope. It becomes a radioactive, and it gives off high energy particles. Now that doesn't always happen. Not all isotopes are radioactive. Not all isotopes are radioisotopes. Some are stable. But let's take an example. Let's look at carbon. So carbon, the most common form of carbon that's out there in the world and in your body, is carbon-12. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. But basically, this is a form of carbon that has 6 neutrons and 6 protons. That's where the 12 comes from. We add those together. But we can have carbon-14 as well. You've probably heard of that before. Carbon-14 is unstable, and it breaks down. It gives off a small amount of high energy particles. It's radioactive, although not terribly radioactive. Carbon-14 has 6 protons, but it has 8 neutrons. It still has 6 electrons. It still has the chemical properties of carbon-12, but it's a radioisotope. In some cases, we can have isotopes where they're stable, but we can actually isolate isotopes from each other by their weight. If there's more neutrons, they actually weigh a little bit more. And the reason that this is important is that isotopes and radioisotopes are used quite commonly in medicine. In fact, we already talked about this a bit. So in the last lecture, in our first lecture, we talked about PET scans, where you're using glucose that has isotopes within it. So carbon isotopes and other isotopes that will give off mild radioactivity. They give off some high energy particles as they break down. So an unstable atom, when it splits apart, will release some energy that we can detect. A compound is made up of identical molecules, and a molecule is made up of more than one element. So a nice example would be water. Let's say you had pure water in front of you. It would be made up of molecules of H2O, and each of those molecules would consist of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So it's a compound because it contains more than one element. It contains more than one type of atom. Now, strictly speaking, water doesn't stay like that. It breaks apart and reforms and so on, but we'll get into that in a bit when we talk about pH. What's the simplest way to represent the atom? Well, this would be it here. We're going to represent it as a little solar system, basically. We've got electrons circling around a nucleus. Now, as I've mentioned, this is not technically correct. The orbits are a bit more complicated than that. They're not shaped like simple circles or shells, but this will work for what we have to do. And in science, we generally tend to stick with the simplest model that explains what we're looking at. So with hydrogen, typically, we've got a proton and an electron orbiting it. There's not usually a neutron, and that's kind of unusual. There are some forms of hydrogen that do have neutrons. So if we have a proton and a neutron and an electron, that's something known as deuterium. Deutero means 2, so there's 2 bits to the proton. We can also have something called tritium. Tri means 3, where we have 2 neutrons in the center. Tritium is something that is a byproduct of atomic bombs and things like that. It's not something that's typically found naturally. Anyway, I kind of am getting off topic here. Hydrogen typically has this form here. It can lose the electron, and then we just have a hydrogen proton, or simply a proton, floating around. That can be quite important. When we talk about acidity, you'll see that really what it is just a whole lot of protons. If something happens that releases a ton of hydrogen protons into a cell or into your blood or something like that, it increases the acidity of that solution. And hydrogen protons just wandering around on their own are typically quite reactive, and that's why acidic conditions can be problematic, or in the case of what's going on in your stomach, they can help you unravel proteins and break them down and digest them. Next to that, we've got a carbon atom. So you can see that we have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. You can't see all of them there. And then we have 6 electrons around the outside. And notice that they are in shells. They're in layers. So we have these concentric spheres or orbits around the nucleus in the center. And another thing to notice right now is that the first shell only has 2 electrons. And then notice that the outer shell around that has 4. There is an arrangement to the electrons. There are rules that the electrons follow. The number of protons in the atoms determines what element it is. That's rather important. So with hydrogen, we've got 1 proton. That means it's hydrogen. If we add a neutron to that, we've got deuterium, but that is a type of hydrogen. If we add another neutron, we've got tritium, but that is a type of hydrogen. So the number of protons determines what element it is that we're looking at. The chemistry of an element is determined by the number of electrons that make up the atoms that it's composed of. And the number of electrons should match the number of protons, unless we're dealing with an ion, which we'll get to a bit later. What you're seeing here is a portion of something called the periodic table, and the periodic table is an arrangement of elements based on the number of protons. So each one of the elements has its own characteristic symbol. So we can see here we have H, which is hydrogen. The lower number to the left of the H is the atomic number, and the atomic number is the number of protons. So hydrogen, 1. Helium, He, 2. Lithium, 3. Beryllium, 4. Boron, 5. Carbon, 6, etc. Above that atomic number, we have the mass number. And the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Now, notice that in most cases, but not all, the number of neutrons and the number of protons is the same. So if we look at carbon there, C, we have 6 protons. We know that because the lower number, the atomic number, is 6. We have 6 neutrons because the atomic mass, or the mass number, is 12. And 6 plus 6 equals 12. Now, not all of them add up that nice. And that's because there are some elements that characteristically have an odd number of neutrons, a number of neutrons that doesn't match the number of protons. Now, it's also worth noting that these are averages. So for carbon, it's not exactly 12 because there's a little bit of carbon-14 out there. For each of these elements, there may be a few different isotopes. So the mass numbers have been rounded off. The mass that we're talking about here is measured in kind of a theoretical unit known as atomic mass units, or daltons. And that is basically the mass of a proton or a neutron. But again, the elements that are out there in the real world, they consist of different isotopes, and that kind of upsets the numbers slightly. These are rounded off. But once again, just to sum up, atomic number, that's the number of protons. That's the really important number, and that determines the placement of the element in the periodic table. Mass number is the number of protons and neutrons that we see out there in the wild averaged. And not only are the mass numbers averaged, they're also rounded off in most of the diagrams I'm going to show you. It's not really important for us. I don't expect you to know that level of detail. I'm just pointing that out in case you have some chemistry background and you're kind of wondering why these slides are a bit simplified. But if you take a look, for example, in this periodic table, the example here of molybdenum, we've got an atomic number of 42, and in this table it's shown in the upper right. That refers to the number of protons, and down here we've got 95.96. That refers to a more accurate depiction of the atomic mass. And again, this is averaged over all of the molybdenum atoms that you might come across out there in the real world. Okay, so here we've got a full periodic table, and I don't expect you to memorize this, of course. I don't even expect you to know the different groups. Just note that different groups and different colors do have specific characteristics, and that's based on the number of electrons they have, specifically the number of electrons that they have in their outer shell. And we'll come back to this, but just note, for instance, the last column here, these are known as the noble gases. And their outer electron shell, the valence shell, we'll talk about that in just a second, is completely full. And that makes them very, very non-reactive. They're not trying to lose electrons or gain electrons, and they don't tend to react. So for instance, argon there, the third one down, that makes up part of the air you breathe in. Your body has absolutely no use for it. It can't do anything with it. Next to that, we have what are known as the halogens. And these are quite different. They're very reactive. So they just need one electron to fill their outer shell, as we'll talk about in a moment. And that means they're very reactive. And we will talk about some of these when we talk about microbiology and how we kill microbes if you're taking that course, because these are things that are quite reactive. Chlorine is quite reactive. Anyway, the atoms that we are interested in are the ones that are involved in life, that play a role in living cells and living bodies. And there's 25 of these elements. And there's 4 of them that are especially important. And really, the only atoms that I want you to know about in a bit of detail are those 4 atoms. And those 4 atoms are hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. I don't know if you want to try and form a word out of this. C-H-O-N, chon, is that a word? Probably not, but maybe that'll help you. These 4 elements form the basis of life and make up most of the mass of living cells and living things. All right, so here's a table that shows you the percentage of the human body weight by element. You can see that oxygen alone makes up 65% of the human body weight. And I should note that this is the wet weight, not the dried out weight. Okay, so oxygen. It's a major component of water. So water is H2O. Each water molecule consists of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And you might be wondering, well, why isn't hydrogen higher on the list? Well, hydrogen, remember, only has 1 proton, which makes up the vast majority of the weight of the atom, and then 1 tiny little light electron. Whereas oxygen has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, so it's a much heavier atom. So after oxygen, we have carbon. After that, we have hydrogen. There is a lot of it. It's attached to most of the organic molecules that you have in your body, and also it is a component of water. And then we have nitrogen, which is found in all sorts of things. It's found in your DNA and RNA. It's found in your proteins. It makes up part of the backbone of your proteins, etc. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen together make up 96% of living matter, living cells, and living bodies. The next four rather important ones are phosphorus. We'll talk about phosphorus in quite a bit of detail later on, but it's found in adenosine triphosphate, which is a very important molecule that shuttles energy around in your cells. It's found in other nucleotides. Nucleotides make up DNA and RNA, and it has a lot of other roles as well. Sulfur, quite important in proteins. Calcium, as you probably guessed, it's found in your bones. It's a rather important mineral for strengthening your bones and providing structural support. But it's also really important when it comes to muscle contraction and nerve conduction and a bunch of other things. And potassium. So potassium with a K, that can be kind of confusing, is really important in nerve contraction and some other things we'll talk about as well. So together those four make up almost the remaining 4%. I've rounded up here, of course, because there's still some other stuff that's important. So we have what are known as trace elements. Trace elements are found in very small amounts, so a tiny fraction of a percent. So that would be iron, Fe, and I should mention that the names for the elements come from Latin, typically. So Fe stands for ferrum, which is iron. We have copper and zinc, both of which are quite important in the functioning of some enzymes. We have iodine, which plays a critical role in the manufacture and structure of hormones that are produced by your thyroid, for instance. So atoms have these shells or orbits, and if they fill that shell, they become stable. So we have these concentric shells, and each shell can only hold a certain number of electrons. The innermost shell or orbit can only hold 2 electrons. And then outside of that, we have a larger shell that can hold 8. Outside of that, we have a larger shell that can hold 8. Outside of that, we have a larger shell that can hold 8, and then things get more complicated after that. But fortunately, the larger atoms are not involved in biological reactions. So let's take a look here at our periodic table again. Look at helium. Helium only has that inner shell, and it's got 2 electrons, and that fills the shell. Helium will hold on to those electrons. If it comes into contact with another atom, it's unlikely to give up those electrons. And that makes helium quite stable and non-reactive. It is a noble gas. Noble gases do not react very readily. Hydrogen, on the other hand, has only 1 electron in its outer shell, and it could hold another one. There's 2 ways that it could become more stable. It could pick up another electron, or it could get rid of that electron and give it up. There's another way too, actually. It could share an electron with another atom. And that's what hydrogen normally does. So hydrogen that's floating around in the atmosphere as a gas doesn't exist as 1 hydrogen atom. It exists as 2, and those 2 hydrogen atoms are bonded together. They're sharing electrons so that they both have a filled outer shell, and we'll come back to that. Now, helium is quite non-reactive, as I mentioned. It doesn't interact with other atoms, and again, that's because chemical reactions come down to the movement of electrons, the loss, gain, or excitation of electrons. So you can take a balloon and fill it with helium, put a match under it, hold a candle up to it. Nothing's going to happen. It's going to break the balloon, but there's not going to be a big bang. There's not going to be any fire. If you take a balloon and fill it with hydrogen, there's going to be a problem if you hold a candle to that balloon. There's going to be a lot of flame and perhaps a loud bang as well, and we'll come back to that. And I mean, that's why the Hindenburg was a big Zeppelin, a blimp, that exploded, went down in flames in 1937. It was filled with hydrogen because hydrogen is cheap to make, and it's pretty good at lifting up something like a large blimp. But it's very reactive and rather dangerous. Okay, so let's take a look at lithium now. Lithium has 3 electrons. The first shell is full. First shell is always going to fill up first, and then after that, the remaining electrons are going to move into the second shell. The second shell only contains 1 electron. If it comes into contact with another atom, it's unlikely it's going to be able to fill that outer shell, so what's probably going to happen is it's going to lose that electron. It's going to give up that electron, and that will give it an outer shell that is full. And that is always the most stable condition for an atom. So atoms, I don't want to give them anthropocentric qualities. They're not thinking about this, of course, but atoms tend towards a more stable condition, and they're more stable if their outermost shell is full. Let's skip ahead to carbon. Carbon's really interesting. It has a full shell in the middle, of course, 2 electrons, and then it has a shell that contains 4 electrons. That outer shell should contain 8 to be stable. It can give up 4, it can gain 4. Both of those are kind of unlikely. What's more likely to happen is it will share 4 electrons with something else. And that will effectively fill the outer shell. Now, once again, if we look at neon and argon, just like helium, they have full outer shells and they're very stable. So you can take neon, of course, you can put it in a tube, you can run electricity through it. You will get those electrons very excited, and when they are excited, they will release photons of light, but the neon itself, that atom is not affected. It's not going to result in a big explosion. If you filled a tube with hydrogen, you ran electricity through it, you would have a problem. And argon, again, very, very stable atom. It's one of the noble gases. Helium, neon, and argon don't tend to react with other atoms. That outermost shell is known as the valence shell, and it's the valence electrons that interact during chemical reactions, and only the valence electrons. So when we're talking about chemistry and we're trying to figure out how 2 atoms are going to behave, how they're going to sort things out if we throw them in a room together, what we're interested in is the number of valence electrons. Now, this can be kind of confusing because the number of valence electrons and valence number are not the same thing. Now, let me explain what I mean here. Let's look at hydrogen. Hydrogen has 1 valence electron. It has 1 electron in its outermost shell, and we say it has also a valence of 1. Now let's look at carbon. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. We say that it has 4 valence electrons, and again it has a valence number of 4. Okay, so far they're the same. But now let's look at nitrogen. Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons in its outer shell, but it has a valence number of 3. Now what I mean by that is the easiest way for it to fill its outer shell, to fill that valence shell, is to steal 3 electrons away from something else. And now let's look at oxygen. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its valence shell. So it has 6 valence electrons. It has a valence number of 2. And that's because what oxygen is most likely to do to fill that valence shell is it's going to steal away 2 electrons from something else. So if we have a positive number here, that means when we're talking about valence numbers that that atom is likely to lose those electrons to fill its shell. So in the case of hydrogen, it's actually going to lose that shell altogether. It's just going to become a proton. That's the most likely thing to happen. Carbon could go either way, but it's going to share stuff, as we'll see. Nitrogen, it's going to take in electrons. It's going to pull them away from other atoms. Oxygen is going to pull electrons away from other atoms. And incidentally, when you rip electrons off of something, that's known as oxidation. And that name comes from the property of oxygen to rip electrons away from other things. So why is this important? Well, as mentioned, an atom tends towards its most stable state. It's more stable when its valence electron is filled. Or in the odd case of hydrogen, hydrogen will sometimes just get rid of that electron and give up on its valence shell. To fill the valence shell, an atom could steal away electrons, or it could get rid of a valence shell that's not full by giving up electrons, or it could share electrons with another atom. And this is the basis of chemical reactions and chemical bonding. Chemical bonds occur when we have one atom interacting with another atom. And once again, the chemical behavior of the participants is going to depend on their valence numbers. So atoms are going to attempt to stabilize their electron counts in the valence shell by forming chemical bonds. And there's 2 types of chemical bonds that we'll look at first. One is known as a covalent bond, where the atoms are sharing electrons, and the other is known as an ionic bond, where one participant is going to lose electrons and the other is going to gain electrons, but then because they have differential charges, the atoms may be attracted to each other. Covalent bonds occur when 2 or more atoms come together and share electrons. So here we've got an example with hydrogen. I talked about this already. Hydrogen, if it's not attached to something else as part of a molecule, typically exists as a gas. But it doesn't exist as a single atom. 2 hydrogen atoms will come together and share their 1 electron to effectively fill both of their valence shells. So those electrons aren't married to one particular proton. They're going to spend part of their time going around one, and then they'll do a few revolutions around the next one, back and forth, and in effect it fills the 2 shells for each of those atoms. When we have 2 hydrogen atoms bound together in this way, we say that we've got a diatomic molecule. So di meaning 2. So hydrogen normally exists as a diatomic molecule. Oxygen does as well. Oxygen will not exist as 1 atom. It's 2 atoms stuck together in most cases. And it's important to note that with covalent bonds, we're always talking about sharing pairs of valence electrons. So in the last example with diatomic hydrogen, we were sharing a pair of electrons between 2 hydrogen atoms. And we can have several atoms held together in covalent arrangements. So we could have a situation where we have 5 atoms that are sharing electrons in order to fill their valence shells. So again, with diatomic hydrogen, we've got the sharing of one pair of electrons, and we can represent that in a simple shorthand, a short form diagram that you can see on the right here. We would represent that shared pair of electrons as a single dash. Oxygen, remember that it has 6 electrons in its valence shell. It has a valence number of 2, which means it just needs 2 electrons to fill up its outer shell. 2 oxygens can come together and share 2 pairs of electrons, as you can see in part B of that diagram. That is a double bond. So we have 2 straight lines in our shorthand diagram there that are representing the sharing of 2 pairs of electrons. With water, what we've got here is oxygen sharing electrons with 2 hydrogens, and that's going to fulfill the requirements of all of the valence shells for each of those atoms. So the hydrogen atoms, remember, have 1 spare electron. We have 2 of them. That will effectively fill the 2 missing slots in the valence shell of the oxygen. At the bottom there, we've got methane, and methane consists of 1 carbon. Carbon has a valence number of 4. It's got 4 electrons in its outer shell, and it can share electrons with 4 separate hydrogen atoms to fill that shell. All of our atoms are stable and happy, and we would represent that as a C for carbon with 4 straight lines representing 4 shared pairs of electrons between the carbons and the hydrogens. Another really important concept that we need to consider is electronegativity, and this is the affinity of an atom for electrons. If an atom has a high electronegativity, it is kind of greedy. It tends to strip electrons away from other things. So I won't talk about how the value itself is determined, but just note that a high value means high electronegativity, means a high affinity for electrons. So let's compare a couple different atoms here. Hydrogen has an electronegativity of 2.1. Oxygen has an electronegativity of 3.5, quite a bit higher. If we bring oxygen and hydrogen together to make water, for instance, oxygen will pull the hydrogen's electrons closer to its nucleus. So the electrons are physically pulled away from the atom that has the lower electronegativity, and the electrons spend more time orbiting the oxygen, orbiting the atom with the higher electronegativity, than they do orbiting the atom with the lower electronegativity. If we bring hydrogen and carbon together, because they have similar electronegativities, they will share the electrons pretty much equally. So we have 2 types of covalent bonds. In both types, electrons are shared, but in polar covalent bonds, the electrons are not shared equally. So what you're seeing here is water, H2O. Oxygen has a higher electronegativity, and that means that the electrons are pulled away from the hydrogen towards the oxygen. They spend more time circling the oxygen, they spend less time circling the hydrogen, and they are physically closer to the nucleus of the oxygen atom. So if we were to take a snapshot of this and look at the charges, we would see that the oxygen is slightly negative compared to the slightly positive hydrogens, because the oxygens are more likely to have those shared electrons than the hydrogens are. So there's this tug of war that goes on between any atoms that have unlike electronegativities. Atoms don't play fair, so to speak. Sometimes they share the electrons and sometimes they don't. It depends on the electronegativity of the 2 players. So in nonpolar covalent bonds, electrons are shared equally, and a nice example would be a diatomic molecule like oxygen, O2. So 2 oxygen atoms stuck together, or diatomic hydrogen. Of course, in that case, for those molecules, the atoms are the same, so they have the same electronegativity. Methane, CH4, hydrogen and carbon don't have the exact same electronegativity, but it's pretty close. In a polar covalent bond, there is unequal sharing. And a good example of that, of course, would be water that we talked about already. Now, that little squiggle there next to the oxygen and hydrogen is a symbol that stands for dipole. A molecule that has a dipole is a molecule that has a slight charge. And once again, it's due to the fact that electrons are spending more time around the oxygen than they are around the hydrogen. And that gives us a slight negative charge to the oxygen, not a full-on negative charge. We don't have one full extra electron, but we're more likely to see these additional electrons around the oxygen. And it gives us a slight positive charge to the hydrogen, because we're less likely to see the shared electrons there. We're going to see the added influence of the protons. So I know I'm probably repeating myself, but I just want to make sure it's absolutely clear. In a case where we have two atoms that come together that have the same electronegativity or a very similar electronegativity, we're going to get a non-polar covalent bond if they're sharing electrons. A covalent bond is the result of a shared pair of electrons. So we can have one covalent bond between two atoms. We can have two, and that's a double bond if it's between only two atoms. But we can even have three if we're talking about two atoms bound to each other. Nitrogen also typically exists in a diatomic state. So 78% of the air around us, the air that you breathe, is nitrogen. And it consists of two nitrogen atoms triple bonded to each other. That's a really tough bond to break, and your body can't break it. So you need nitrogen. You need it to make nucleotides for DNA. You use it to make amino acids for proteins, etc. But you can't actually get nitrogen from the air because you can't break those triple bonds. They're very, very tough. Sharing electrons results in very, very tough bonds, difficult bonds to break, but there are other bonds as well. We can have a situation where one atom completely steals electrons from another atom. So there's no sharing that goes on. Now, if that happens, that's going to result in two atoms that have full-on charge differentials. And we call those atoms at this point ions. So here's the classic example here. We have sodium, and sodium has one stray electron in its valence shell. And if we bring that into contact with chlorine, what's going to happen is the chlorine is going to steal that electron because chlorine is missing one electron from its outer shell. So this is where the valence numbers are rather important. Chlorine will almost always strip things away. It's a very reactive molecule because it just needs that one electron to fill its shell. Sodium, on the other hand, if it gives up one electron, we lose that shell, and then we're left with the second shell that is full. It has 8 electrons in it. So after this happens, after the electron is transferred from sodium to chlorine, we get two charged atoms. So we have sodium plus, and that's because we've got one more proton than we do electrons. And that sodium plus is known as a sodium ion. And then we have the chlorine, which is going to gain an electron, and it's going to have a full-on negative charge. And when I say full-on negative charge, what I'm referring to here is that protons have 1 unit of positive charge, electrons have 1 unit of negative charge. So we've got a full-on 1 unit of negative charge in our chloride ion. The other thing to note is that positive ions are known as cation ions, and negative ions are known as anions. Ions. So if you're a cat person, I guess, I'm kind of a dog person, but if you're a cat person, I guess cats are positive. Maybe that'll help you remember it. So we have these two ions that result. We have a cation and an anion. Now remember that unlike charges, positive and negative will attract each other. So just like within the atom, a cation and an anion will tend to stick together. They're attracted to each other. The opposite charges attract, and then we form something called a salt. And sodium chloride is table salt. Now, these bonds are not nearly as strong. The ions can be disassociated quite easily. So if you take, of course, table salt and throw it into some water, it will just dissolve or dissociate into free sodium and chloride ions. And it is really pretty amazing what happens. Sodium is a soft metal. You can cut it with a knife. It's very reactive. In fact, you keep it in oil. You don't let it become exposed to water or air because it will actually ignite. Chlorine is typically found as a gas or a very volatile liquid, and it's very toxic. Both of these substances are quite toxic, but if you bring them together, you get table salt, which of course is rather tasty. And if you look at a crystal of table salt, what you've got is a very precise alignment of sodium and chloride ions that form a crystal. So chlorine is going to steal an electron from sodium. Unlike charges are going to attract after that, and the product is very, very different from the reactants that we start with. There are two more weaker chemical bonds that we should talk about, and the first one would be hydrogen bonding. So in this diagram here at the top there, we've got a water molecule. Remember, it has a dipole, so the oxygen is slightly negative, the hydrogens are slightly positive, and underneath that we have ammonia. Ammonia is NH3. So if you remember, nitrogen has 5 electrons in the valence shell, so it's got a valence number of 3. It needs to assimilate 3 pairs of electrons to fill its shell. And it does that by attaching to hydrogens. Now, because nitrogen also has a high electronegativity, it's going to steal the electrons away from the hydrogen, not completely, but it's going to pull them closer. And that means that the nitrogen is slightly negative. The adjacent water molecules will have hydrogens that are slightly positive. And so there's this attraction, a fairly weak attraction, between the hydrogen and nitrogen. Now, if you have household ammonia, what they've done is they've taken ammonia gas and they've bubbled it through water and dissolved the ammonia in the water, which happens quite readily because of this hydrogen bonding. And the molecules are moving around. The hydrogen bond between adjacent molecules is constantly breaking and reforming. A weaker force, but one that's really important on large molecules, is something known as van der Waals forces. And this is due to random hotspots of charge within a large molecule. And this is occurring because, as I mentioned before, electrons are constantly moving around. On a really large molecule like a protein, electrons are bumping all over the place. We've got these very slight charges that form. So a slight positive charge as an electron leaves an atom, and a negative charge as it comes back, and so on. So over the surface of a large molecule, we're going to have very, very slight, transient, short-lived charges. But if you take 2 large molecules and bring them next to each other, all of those little tiny charges are going to cause them to stick together. Van der Waals forces are small individually, but once again, if it's over a huge surface area, the end result can be quite impressive. And it's a fairly recent discovery that lizards like geckos use van der Waals forces and also hydrogen bonding to climb up walls and climb across ceilings and climb over really smooth surfaces like glass. So if you take a look at the foot of a gecko, there's ridges, and on those ridges there's folds, etc. And ultimately very, very, very fine hairs. And those hairs result in a very, very large surface area over which van der Waals forces and hydrogen bonding can occur with the glass and other smooth surfaces that they climb across. So although these forces are tiny individually, there are a lot of them, and that can be really important. It can be really important in biology for situations where you want to be able to break the forces individually so that you can move, in the case of a gecko. Or if we're talking about DNA, for instance, the two halves, the two strands of DNA, are held together by hydrogen bonds that can be broken a few at a time and allow the DNA to unzip. But at the same time, with so many of those bonds, the DNA molecule is quite strong. A chemical reaction is a change, but it's basically just a rearrangement of electrons. So remember, it's the valence electrons that are important. Typically, there's at least two steps to a chemical reaction. We have to break some bonds, and then we have to reform some new bonds. And in the process, we form new associations between atoms. The substances we start with are known as the reactants. The substances we end up with are known as the products. Now keep in mind, and I'm not going to have you balance equations or anything on a test, but keep in mind that the mass of the reactants has to equal the total mass of the products. That's something known as the law of conservation of mass, and that applies for each element. So in a chemical reaction, we're not creating new elements, we're creating new compounds, but we're not creating new elements. We're not destroying elements. So for instance, the amount of carbon on the left and right of the equation should be the same. The amount of oxygen on the right and left has to be the same. A few more quick definitions. Energy is broadly defined as the capacity to do work, generally to create movement. Kinetic energy is the energy associated with matter that is already in motion. So I mentioned before that temperature is quite literally a measure of kinetic energy. It's a measure of how quickly molecules are moving or vibrating. Potential energy is energy that is stored by matter due to its position, if we're talking about physics, or due to chemical bonds, if we're talking about chemistry, which is what we're talking about. The total amount of energy present at the beginning and end of a chemical reaction is the same. So just like mass, energy can not be created or destroyed, although it can be converted from one form to another, and that's the law of conservation of energy. So we have the law of conservation of mass, we have the law of conservation of energy. So energy can be converted from potential energy stored in the bonds of your food, for instance, converted into movement of you. So in any chemical reaction, bonds are going to be broken, new bonds are going to be formed. Metabolism within your cells is the sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body. And there are thousands of these reactions, and they're all interconnected. So the end product of one reaction might be used as the starting point of another reaction. But once again, just remember, in all of these reactions, we have conservation of mass and we have conservation of energy. So in this little example here, we're combining hydrogen with oxygen to produce water. Now, I don't know if you had a crazy chemistry teacher in high school. Hopefully you did. I did. Really popular experiment. You can take 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, combine that in a balloon, light a candle underneath it, and you get a big bang and the production of water. It's a very, very energetic reaction. Not something I suggest you try yourself, but maybe I'll put some links up on Moodle. You might be wondering, how do we get energy out of our food? I mentioned that it takes energy to break a bond. And of course, when you're digesting food, you're breaking the food apart. So it would seem that that would simply require energy. After you break your food apart, though, there's a second part to this whole process. You're going to take those hydrogen atoms and those carbon atoms and combine them with oxygen and make new bonds. And that process releases more energy than you had to put in to break down the food initially. So the amount of energy that it takes to break a bond is known as the bond energy for that particular bond. It's also the amount of energy that's released when that bond forms. So for instance, if we look at a hydrogen to hydrogen bond, so a single bond like we would have in diatomic hydrogen, we can see from the chart on the right that that has a bond energy of 436 kilojoules per mole. Well, forming that bond releases 436 kilojoules per mole. So again, it's the energy required to break a bond, but also the energy that's given off when that bond forms. So how is this important? Well, let's take a look at how polar and nonpolar bonds differ. Nonpolar bonds, like the bonds we have between hydrogen and hydrogen, between carbon and carbon, between carbon and hydrogen, between oxygen and oxygen, these bonds have low bond energies, whereas polar bonds, like between oxygen and carbon or oxygen and hydrogen, have higher bond energies. And what you're doing when you break down your food is you are taking nonpolar, low bond energy bonds, breaking them, and then rearranging the parts and creating polar bonds with much higher bond energies. So you get more energy out than you put in. This is what makes life possible. This is what is responsible for your need for food and your need for oxygen. It's also responsible for the fact that you're breathing out carbon dioxide, as we'll talk about more in the future and in 112. So polar covalent bonds have higher bond energies than non-polar covalent bonds, and that allows you to extract stored energy from your food. When electrons move closer to an atom that is more electronegative, free energy is made available. So when we take methane and we combine it with oxygen, we end up with carbon dioxide and water, and the electrons move closer towards the oxygen. And that frees up energy. We get a release of energy. And these kind of reactions are spontaneous. At least that's how we describe them in chemistry. They're not entirely spontaneous. We do have to put in a little bit of energy typically to get things started. So if you have methane and it's exposed to oxygen, you do have to supply a spark, just a tiny bit of energy. And what that energy will do is it will break the atoms apart so that the atoms can rearrange themselves into a more stable situation. And the more stable situation is with the electrons pulled closer towards the oxygen atoms. So a reaction like you're seeing here, where you're burning methane, is exothermic. It's going to give off energy. It's going to give off heat and light as well. These reactions also increase entropy. So there's an increased disorder in the system. So if we look at an explosive, you're starting with typically fairly large molecules, highly ordered molecules that are broken down through this two-step process into much simpler molecules. And in the process, we have a great release of energy as heat and light. Let's look at a familiar example. Let's look at the propane in your barbecue. And I've put this on a nice background of green grass because, well, the grass will be dead soon and covered in snow, which is kind of sad. But in the middle here, I've got propane. It consists of 3 carbons with 8 hydrogens attached. And then around that, I've got some oxygen molecules. Remember, oxygen has a valence number of 2. It wants to fill its outer shell. It'll do that by pairing up with another oxygen atom. Now, the thing to note here is that all of the bonds you're seeing are non-polar covalent bonds. And these little circles here are meant to represent the location of the pairs of electrons. They're pretty evenly distributed between the 2 atoms. Of course, oxygen and oxygen have the same electronegativity. Carbon and carbon, same electronegativity. Carbon and hydrogen, pretty close in electronegativity. Now let's say that you've got the propane valve open on your barbecue and you flick the sparker. What's going to happen is that little bit of energy that you put in with the spark is going to split some of the molecules. It's going to break the bonds. So what I've done there is I've broken a diatomic oxygen molecule. I've broken a couple of hydrogens off the propane. They've come together and they've formed water. And note that the electrons have moved closer to the oxygen. And we have a release of energy, that little flash, that occurs as a result when that new bond formed. So it didn't take much energy to break the original non-polar bonds, but the polar bonds that formed gave off more energy. And of course, the same thing is going to happen to produce carbon dioxide. And once again, the electrons move closer towards the oxygens, and that releases some energy as that occurs. And this is going to happen with all of those atoms. They're going to rearrange themselves, and we're going to get much simpler molecules. So we started off with a relatively large complex molecule, and now we get a lot of simple molecules. And we've gone from having nothing but non-polar bonds to having nothing but polar bonds. Take a look at the balanced equation for that reaction. So again, we have propane, C3H8. We have 5 diatomic oxygen molecules. We're going to combine those. We're going to provide a little bit of a spark to break all of those bonds, and then the atoms are going to rearrange themselves into carbon dioxide and water. On the left side here, you can see the amount of energy it takes to break each of those bonds. So I won't go through all of it, but just as an example, the C to H bonds, each one of those bonds has a bond energy of 411 kilojoules, and we have to break 8 of those. So 8 times 411 gives you 3,288 kilojoules, etc. So what you can do is you can calculate the amount of energy required to break each of those bonds, and you get 6,450 kilojoules. On the other side, we can see the amount of energy that's given off, because remember, bond energy is the amount of energy needed to break a bond. It's also the amount of energy given off when a bond forms. And you can see that we get a lot more energy out than we put in. And we can do the math on this. We have our inputted energy, we minus what we get out, and we get minus 216 kilojoules for that reaction. The negative sign tells us that energy is released. We always do it the same way. We always subtract the products from the reactants. If it was a plus sign in front of that, that would mean that we had to put energy in. So if it's a negative sign, that means that we released energy. If it's a positive sign, that means that we invested energy, we stored energy in the molecules. For Respiration is the process that occurs in every cell in your body to break down food molecules and release energy. It's the same thing that's happening when we burn propane, but instead of happening in two big steps, it occurs in a lot of little steps. So in this example here, we're taking glucose and we're breaking that down into carbon dioxide and water. And just like before, we start with a rather complex molecule, glucose. We're going to break that down into much simpler things. The first reaction or set of reactions that break down glucose requires an input of energy. But then when we make the smaller molecules of carbon dioxide and water, we get an excess of energy back. So respiration, as seen in this equation, has a net balance of negative 2,872 kilojoules per mole. Again, the negative means that we're getting energy out of it. We're freeing up energy. Incidentally, photosynthesis is the exact same reaction. It just occurs in reverse. And plants, what they do is they take energy from the sun and they invest that energy to build glucose. Now notice that there's no negative sign there. I could have put a plus sign, but it's just kind of understood if it's not there, that there's a plus sign. Because there's no negative sign, that means that with photosynthesis, plants are actually investing energy and storing energy into glucose that then they break down, and of course that we can use as well. So on the right of this diagram, you can see sugar being combusted with oxygen. This is what you might do if you took sugar and you actually burned it with a flame. So we would have sugar would combine with oxygen, we'd have lots of energy put in, we'd get a very quick reaction with lots of heat and light and so on, and we would get carbon dioxide and water out of that. Now in your cells, things don't happen all at once like this because your body wouldn't be able to capture that energy effectively. You would basically just spontaneously combust. So instead, there's a number of little reactions that occur, and you can see that on the left. But notice on the right, there's something called an activation energy. And this is the energy you have to put in to start the combustion process. So once again, in sugar, if we actually burn it, there's only two steps. We supply energy, usually a heat source, a spark, a flame, to break those bonds, and then they instantly reform. Again, the same overall process occurs in our bodies, but it happens in several small steps. And many of those steps require an input of energy. We'll look at many examples of reactions that occur in cells, and we'll talk about how cells are able to store energy and also how they release energy. We'll come back to that later, but just for the moment, just remember that an exergonic reaction is one in which the reactants have more potential energy than the products. So free energy has been freed up, and we can use it to do something. Usually we use that to build ATP, and we'll come back to that as well. I should also mention an exothermic reaction is one that generates heat. So most exergonic reactions are also exothermic. But to be proper, when we're talking about metabolism in cells, we should use the term exergonic. We also have endergonic reactions where we're storing energy. So in this case, the reactants have less potential energy than the products. And we have to bring in energy from another source in order to store that energy in the products of the reaction. And typically the products of the reaction are going to be more complex than the reactants that we started with. An anabolic pathway or reaction is one that builds larger, more complex molecules from simpler subunits. Think of anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids build up muscle. So we're building things. So in the example here, we've got some people working on a structure. They're taking bits and pieces and they're building something more complex. And in the process, that structure is storing gravitational energy, for instance. Now, in the case of chemicals and compounds that you might have in your body, we're taking subunits, like perhaps amino acids, putting them together and building more complex molecules, like, for instance, proteins. This is an endergonic reaction. It means that it requires energy to do this. It requires energy to stick A and B together to make AB. Catabolic reactions are reactions where we take larger, ordered, complex molecules and break them down into smaller pieces. In the process, we increase disorder, so we increase entropy. And these reactions are exergonic. They release energy. Energy is made available to do something with. And again, that's because we're taking molecules apart, taking the little pieces, the individual atoms, sticking them to atoms like oxygen, and forming these polar covalent bonds that have higher bond energies. In the example here in this picture, we've got a building that is being detonated. So what's happening is there's small charges of explosives that are weakening the structure, and then the structure is falling, and it's falling and collapsing because of all that stored potential gravitational energy that's there. So again, catabolic reactions release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler things, and anabolic reactions consume energy to build complex molecules, because your cells have to build proteins and DNA and so on. And also your cells store energy for use later. So manufacturing triglycerides, for instance, your fat cells, your adipose cells, store a lot of energy as fat. Once again, examples, glucose can be broken down in the presence of oxygen to simpler molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and we have energy being freed up. Amino acids can be linked together to form proteins, but that requires an input of energy. An important molecule that I've alluded to a few times is adenosine triphosphate, and this is the structure of that molecule here, and it's used for a lot of different things. It's used to build nucleic acids, first of all. It's also used as a signaling molecule. And perhaps most importantly, it's used to shuttle energy between reactions that release energy and reactions that require energy. So you can see it consists of a nitrogenous base, that's in the top right there, and then we have a ribose sugar, and then we have 3 phosphate groups linked together. Your cells can pull a phosphate off and in the process release some energy, because that phosphate will immediately combine with oxygen, and that is an energetic reaction. Or we can start with adenosine diphosphate, which only has 2 phosphates, invest a little bit of energy and stick a phosphate onto it to store energy. Now it's worth noting that ATP is only for very short-term storage of energy. If your body needs to transport energy around through the circulatory system and so on, it's going to use something like glucose. There's other choices too, ketones and so on. We'll get into that later. If your body wants to store energy for a very long time, it can use fats. But for very, very quick transfers between reactions that are happening right next to each other in a cell, ATP is the shuttle that accomplishes that. ATP and ADP link exergonic reactions and endergonic reactions within the cell. So we have exergonic reactions that release energy from your food, for instance. And that energy is used to link ADP with inorganic phosphate to make ATP. And now we've stored a bit of energy. And that energy can be used right away in an endergonic reaction that requires energy. So that phosphate that was added will be pulled off again. And in the process, we have some energy released that can be used to build macromolecules. And this molecule, this ATP, is recycled over and over and over again. So in that process of releasing energy to fuel an endergonic reaction, the phosphate's pulled off, we're back to ADP and inorganic phosphate again. The entire set of chemical reactions that occur within a cell are known as the cell's metabolism. There's a huge number of reactions, and they're all interconnected. But the important thing to note is that anabolic and catabolic reactions are linked, and ATP is what's shuttling energy between those reactions. Catabolism releases a lot of heat, but any reaction releases heat. So any transfer of energy, any step in this pathway is rather inefficient. And a lot of that energy gets lost as heat that radiates from the cell and of course warms your body, which is not bad because that helps chemical reactions occur more quickly, but ultimately that heat is lost to your surrounding environment. Metabolism is complex. Thousands of reactions interlinked together. What you're seeing in this diagram is just a small portion of those reactions. So every dot in this diagram represents a compound. It represents a molecule. And the line between dots represents a change. It represents a chemical reaction. So you can see there's one line there with a circle at the bottom. I'll just see if I can highlight that here. This part in here that's highlighted. And this is part of cellular respiration, the series of reactions that occur in every single cell to liberate energy from food. And we'll talk about this more a little later. But you can see that the first three steps there are shown in more detail on the right. So again, every dot is a compound, every line is a reaction, and every one of those reactions is catalyzed or helped along by a different enzyme. But also note that all these different pathways are linked together. So let's say that you have glucose and your cell needs the glucose for fuel. It's going to start breaking it down and running it through this process and ultimately converting it into carbon dioxide and water. But let's say that your cell needs lipids, it needs fat more than it needs energy. Well, that pathway can run part way, and then compounds can be taken out, intermediates can be taken out and converted into lipids. So all of these things are interconnected. And as I mentioned, it's an incredibly complex process. So I don't put this here to scare you. Of course, I don't expect you to know any of this or even be able to read it actually. But this is just showing some of the chemical reactions that occur in your body. You can get these massive charts that cover the whole wall that show some of the more important chemical reactions that occur. As I've mentioned many times now, and hopefully kind of driven the point home, all chemical reactions occur in two parts. We have an investment of energy to break bonds, and then a second step where the components, where the atoms are rearranged so that new bonds can form. That little bit of energy we have to put in is known as activation energy. So with the propane example, the spark in the barbecue was the activation energy that got things started. Incidentally, once you start burning propane, there's more than enough heat there to break the bonds in new propane molecules coming into the barbecue so that that reaction continues. But what you're seeing here, we've got potential energy on the y-axis. We've got the reaction, the progress of the reaction on the x-axis. We have to put in a little bit of activation energy to break the initial bonds so that things can rearrange themselves and we get new molecules. And in this case, this is an exergonic reaction. It's releasing some energy. In order for a reaction to occur, molecules have to slam into each other. And they have to slam into each other in exactly the right way and in the right orientation. If you heat up a solution, molecules have more kinetic energy. They hit each other with more energy. There's more likely to be a reaction. So the kinetic energy is going to provide the activation energy. So if you're in a chemistry lab and you want a reaction to occur, quite often just heating it up is enough to get the reaction going. In our cells, typically the concentrations of the reagents are quite low. We don't have these really high velocity molecules slamming into each other, so we require a little bit of help. Catalysts are chemical compounds that speed up chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy. And one of the main ways they do that is by grabbing onto one or more of the reagents and making sure that they collide in exactly the right orientation. So the catalyst will make sure that everything is aligned properly. The catalysts we're going to talk about are enzymes. So we have enzymes in our cells that will make a reaction more likely to occur by lowering the activation energy, and the enzyme can be used over and over again. So the enzyme is not typically damaged in the reaction. It can release reactants and then be used again. So here you're seeing an example of a hypothetical reaction. You can see the activation energy with and without the catalyst, and the catalyst is of course lowering that activation energy. Now, not all catalysts are enzymes. There are some strictly non-biological catalysts as well. So perhaps you've mixed epoxy glue together, for instance. It contains a catalyst. You add that to make the reaction possible. So we won't talk too much about enzymes right now because we are going to talk about it quite a bit more. But enzymes have a spot, a little cleft called the active site, that will bind to reagents. And in the case on the top, what you're seeing there is an enzyme known as lactase, and it binds to the sugar known as lactose, which consists of two parts, glucose and galactose. And what it does is it binds that, it fits that molecule specifically, and it doesn't fit any others, except for some copycats. But it will bind to that lactose, and what it does is it flexes and it stretches the bond between glucose and galactose and exposes it to water, making it more likely that a water molecule will slam into that space between glucose and galactose and break the two parts apart. And like I said, we will talk about this in more detail. One thing to note right now is if you see A's on the end of a word, ASE, that tells you that you're dealing with an enzyme. And the first part of the name generally tells you what the enzyme is grabbing onto and manipulating, breaking down, or sticking together. One last concept I want to touch on is the versatility and importance of carbon. So remember, carbon has a valence of 4, and that means it can share 4 pairs of electrons with other atoms. So it could form 4 single bonds with 4 hydrogens, for instance. But it can also form double bonds and triple bonds, and any combination of those, so long as it adds up to 4 pairs of shared electrons. That means you can build all sorts of things out of carbon. You might remember Tinker Toys, you might not. It's a rather old school toy, but it consisted of blocks of wood that you stuck pegs into, and you could build whatever the heck you wanted. Carbon is like that. So carbon is very versatile and allows for really complex molecules. As far as we know, all life is carbon-based. It's possible there might be silicone-based life out there somewhere because silicone has similar properties, but as far as we know, all life is carbon-based. Life as we know it, of course. Carbon forms the backbone of the numerous complex large or macro molecules that we see in our bodies. So on the left here you can see a hydrocarbon, literally just a chain of carbon with hydrogens attached. That is found in things like fatty acids, in lipids. And towards the right, we've got glucose, which is built around a ring of carbons. Molecules like this are known as organic molecules. Organic in chemistry refers to the fact that they're built around a carbon backbone. And in general, we have a chain of carbons forming the backbone of these organic molecules. And then we have little side groups or side chains that might contain hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and other things that hang off of that give the particular molecule its characteristics. And we'll talk about that in more detail next time. And with all of my topics, I end with a terminology list. These are, once again, the terms that you should focus on when you're learning this material. These are the terms I'll use when I'm making my matching questions and true-false questions and so on for your midterms. So focus on this as you go along, as you read through your textbook, your notes, and that kind of thing. Remember that you have the PowerPoints available to you as well, so feel free to change them however you want, add your own notes, etc. And when I see you again, we will talk about water.